Essay 12 of Modern Essays, selected by Christopher Morley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 12, The Student Life, by William Osler. Sir William Osler, one of the best-loved and most influential teachers of his time, was born in Canada in 1849. He began his education in Toronto and at McGill University, Montreal, where he served as professor of medicine 1874 to 84. Wherever he worked, his gifted and unique personality was a center of inspiration: at the University of Pennsylvania 1884 to 89, at Johns Hopkins 1889 to 1904. In 1904 he went to Oxford as Regius Professor of Medicine. He died in England in 1919. Only our medical friends have a right to speak of the great doctor's place in their own world, but one would like to see his honorable place as a man of letters more generally understood. His generous wisdom and infectious enthusiasm are delightfully expressed in his collected writings. No lover of the essay can afford to overlook Aequanimats and other addresses, An Alabama Student and other biographical essays, Science and Immortality, and Counsels and Ideals, this last an anthology collected from his professional papers by one of his pupils. He stands in the honorable line of those great masters who have found their highest usefulness as kindly counselors of the young. His lucid and exquisite prose, with its extraordinary wealth of quotation from the literature of all ages, and his unfailing humor and tenderness, put him in the first rank of didactic essayists. One could get a liberal education in literature merely by following up all his quotations and references. He was more deeply versed in the classics than many professors of Greek and Latin. The whole music of English poetry seemed to be current in his blood. His essay on Keats, taken from Kipling's wonderful story Via Wireless, tells the student more about that poet than many a volume of biography. When was biography more delightfully written than in his volume, An Alabama Student? Walt Whitman said, when Dr. Osler attended him years ago, "Osler believes in the gospel of encouragement, of putting the best construction on things, the best foot forward. He's a fine fellow and a wise one, I guess." The great doctor's gospel of encouragement is indeed a happy companion for the midnight reader. Rich in every gentle quality that makes life endeared, his books are the most sagacious and helpful of modern writings for the young student. As one who has found them an unfailing delight, I venture to hope that our medical confrères may not be the only readers to enjoy their vivacity and charm. Except it be a lover, no one is more interesting as an object of study than a student. Shakespeare might have made him a fourth in his immortal group. The lunatic with his fixed idea, the poet with his fine frenzy, the lover with his frantic idolatry, and the student aflame with the desire for knowledge, are of imagination all compact. To an absorbing passion, a whole-souled devotion, must be joined an enduring energy, if the student is to become a devotee of the gray-eyed goddess to whose law his services are bound. Like the quest of the Holy Grail, the quest of Minerva is not for all. For the one, the pure life; for the other, what Milton calls a strong propensity of nature. Here again the student often resembles the poet. He is born, not made. While the resultant of two moulding forces, the accidental external conditions and the hidden germinal energies, which produce in each one of us national, family, and individual traits, the true student possesses in some measure a divine spark which sets at naught their laws. Like the Snark, he defies definition, but there are three unmistakable signs by which you may recognize the genuine article from a Boojum: an absorbing desire to know the truth, an unswerving steadfastness in its pursuit, and an open, honest heart, free from suspicion, guile, and jealousy. At the outset do not be worried about this big question, truth. It is a very simple matter if each one of you starts with the desire to get as much as possible. No human being is constituted to know the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, and even the best of men must be content with fragments, with partial glimpses, never the full fruition. In this unsatisfied quest, the attitude of mind, the desire, the thirst, a thirst that from the soul must rise, the fervent longing, are the be-all and the end-all. What is the student but a lover courting a fickle mistress who ever eludes his grasp? In this very elusiveness is brought out his second great characteristic, steadfastness of purpose. Unless from the start the limitations incident to our frail human faculties are frankly accepted, nothing but disappointment awaits you. The truth is the best you can get with your best endeavor, the best that the best men accept. With this you must learn to be satisfied, retaining at the same time, with due humility, an earnest desire for an ever larger portion. Only by keeping the mind plastic and receptive does the student escape perdition. It is not, as Charles Lamb remarks, that some people do not know what to do with truth when it is offered to them, but the tragic fate is to reach, after years of patient search, a condition of mind-blindness in which the truth is not recognized, though it stares you in the face. This can never happen to a man who has followed step by step the growth of a truth and who knows the painful phases of its evolution. It is one of the great tragedies of life that every truth has to struggle to acceptance against honest but mind-blind students. Harvey knew his contemporaries well, and for 12 successive years demonstrated the circulation of the blood before daring to publish the facts on which the truth was based. Footnote: These views, as usual, pleased some more, others less. Some chid and calumniated me, and laid it to me as a crime that I had dared to depart from the precepts and opinions of all anatomists. De Motu Cordis, Chapter 1. End footnote. Only steadfastness of purpose and humility enable the student to shift his position to meet the new conditions in which new truths are born, or old ones modified beyond recognition. And thirdly, the honest heart will keep him in touch with his fellow students, and furnish that sense of comradeship without which he travels an arid waste alone. I say advisedly an honest heart. The honest head is prone to be cold and stern, given to judgment, not mercy, and not always able to entertain that true charity which, while it thinketh no evil, is anxious to put the best possible interpretation upon the motives of a fellow worker. It will foster, too, an attitude of generous, friendly rivalry untinged by the green peril, jealousy, that is the best preventive of the growth of a bastard scientific spirit, loving seclusion and working in a lock-and-key laboratory, as timorous of light as is a thief. You have all become brothers in a great society, not apprentices, since that implies a master, and nothing should be further from the attitude of the teacher than much that is present in that word, used though it be in another sense, particularly by our own French brethren in a most delightful way, signifying a bond of intellectual filiation. A fraternal attitude is not easy to cultivate. The chasm between the chair and the bench is difficult to bridge. Two things have helped to put up a cantilever across the gulf. The successful teacher is no longer on a height, pumping knowledge at high pressure into passive receptacles. The new methods have changed all this. He is no longer Sir Oracle, perhaps unconsciously by his very manner antagonizing minds to whose level he cannot possibly descend, but he is a senior student anxious to help his juniors. When a simple, earnest spirit animates a college, there is no appreciable interval between the teacher and the taught. Both are in the same class, the one a little more advanced than the other. So animated, the student feels that he has joined a family whose honor is his honor, whose welfare is his own, and whose interest should be his first consideration. The hardest conviction to get into the mind of a beginner is that the education upon which he is engaged is not a college course, not a medical course, but a life course, for which the work of a few years under teachers is but a preparation. Whether you will falter and fail in the race, or whether you will be faithful to the end, depends on the training before the start, and on your staying powers, points upon which I need not enlarge. You can all become good students, a few may become great students, and now and again one of you will be found who does easily and well what others cannot do at all, or very badly, which is John Ferriar's excellent definition of a genius. In the hurry and bustle of a business world, which is the life of this continent, it is not easy to train first-class students. Under present conditions it is hard to get the needful seclusion, on which account it is that our educational market is so full of wayside fruit. I have always been much impressed by the advice of St. Chrysostom, "Depart from the highway and transplant thyself in some enclosed ground, for it is hard for a tree which stands by the wayside to keep her fruit till it be ripe." The dilettante is abroad in the land, the man who is always venturing on tasks for which he is imperfectly equipped, a habit of mind fostered by the multiplicity of subjects in the curriculum. And while many things are studied, few are studied thoroughly. Men will not take time to get to the heart of a matter. After all, concentration is the price the modern student pays for success. Thoroughness is the most difficult habit to acquire, but it is the pearl of great price, worth all the worry and trouble of the search. The dilettante lives an easy butterfly life, knowing nothing of the toil and labor with which the treasures of knowledge are dug out of the past, or wrung by patient research in the laboratories. Take, for example, the early history of this country. How easy for the student of the one type to get a smattering, even a fairly full acquaintance, with the events of the French and Spanish settlements. Put an original document before him, and it might as well be Arabic. What we need is the other type, the man who knows the records, who, with a broad outlook, and drilled in what may be called the embryology of history, has yet a powerful vision for the minutiae of life. It is these kitchen and back-stair men who are to be encouraged, the men who know the subject in hand in all possible relationships. Concentration has its drawbacks. It is possible to become so absorbed in the problem of the enclitic de, or the structure of the flagella of the trichomonas, or of the toes of the prehistoric horse, that the student loses the sense of proportion in his work, and even wastes a lifetime in researches which are valueless because not in touch with current knowledge. You remember poor Casaubon in Middlemarch, whose painful scholarship was lost on this account. The best preventive to this is to get denationalized early. The true student is a citizen of the world, the allegiance of whose soul, at any rate, is too precious to be restricted to a single country. The great minds, the great works, transcend all limitations of time, of language, and of race, and the scholar can never feel initiated into the company of the elect until he can approach all of life's problems from the cosmopolitan standpoint. I care not in what subject he may work. The full knowledge cannot be reached without drawing on supplies from lands other than his own. French, English, German, American, Japanese, Russian, Italian. There must be no discrimination by the loyal student, who should willingly draw from any and every source, with an open mind and a stern resolve to render unto all their dues. I care not on what stream of knowledge he may embark, follow up its course, and the rivulets that feed it flow from many lands. If the work is to be effective, he must keep in touch with scholars in other countries. How often has it happened that years of precious time have been given to a problem already solved, or shown to be insoluble, because of the ignorance of what had been done elsewhere? And it is not only book knowledge and journal knowledge, but a knowledge of men that is needed. The student will, if possible, see the men in other lands. Travel not only widens the vision and gives certainties in place of vague surmises, but the personal contact with foreign workers enables him to appreciate better the failings or successes in his own line of work, perhaps to look with more charitable eyes on the work of some brother whose limitations and opportunities have been more restricted than his own. Or in contact with a master mind he may take fire, and the glow of the enthusiasm may be the inspiration of his life. Concentration must then be associated with large views on the relation of the problem, and a knowledge of its status elsewhere. Otherwise it may land him in the slough of a specialism so narrow that it has depth and no breadth, or he may be led to make what he believes to be important discoveries, but which have long been current coin in other lands. It is sad to think that the day of the great polymathic student is at an end, that we may perhaps never again see a Schlager or Haller or a Humboldt, men who took the whole field of knowledge for their domain and viewed it as from a pinnacle. And yet a great specializing generalist may arise, who can tell? Some 20th century Aristotle may be now tugging at his bottle, as little dreaming as are his parents or his friends of a conquest of the mind beside which the wonderful victories of the Stagirite will look pale. The value of a real great student to the country is equal to half a dozen grain elevators or a new transcontinental railway. He is a commodity singularly fickle and variable, and not to be grown to order. So far as his advent is concerned, there is no telling when or where he may arise. The conditions seem to be present even under the most unlikely externals. Some of the greatest students this country has produced have come from small villages and country places. It is impossible to predict from a study of the environment which a strong propensity of nature, to quote Milton's phrase again, will easily bend or break. The student must be allowed full freedom in his work, undisturbed by the utilitarian spirit of the Philistine, who cries cui bono and distrusts pure science. The present remarkable position in applied science and in industrial trades of all sorts has been made possible by men who did pioneer work in chemistry, in physics, in biology, and in physiology, without a thought in their researches of any practical application. The members of this higher group of productive students are rarely understood by the common spirits, who appreciate as little of their unselfish devotion as their unworldly neglect of the practical side of the problems. Everywhere now the medical student is welcomed as an honored member of the guild. There was a time, I confess, and it is within the memory of some of us, when, like Falstaff, he was given to taverns and sack and wine and metheglins, and to drinkings and swearings and starings, pribbles and prabbles. But all that has changed with the curriculum, and the meds now roar you as gently as the theologues. On account of the peculiar character of the subject matter of your studies, what I have said upon the general life and mental attitude of the student applies with tenfold force to you. Man, with all his mental and bodily anomalies and diseases, the machine in order, the machine in disorder, and the business yours to put it to rights. Through all the phases of its career this most complicated mechanism of this wonderful world will be the subject of our study and of your care. The naked, new-born infant, the artless child, the lad and the lassie just aware of the tree of knowledge overhead, the strong man in the pride of life, the woman with the benediction of maternity on her brow, and the aged, peaceful in the contemplation of the past. Almost everything has been renewed in the science and in the art of medicine, but all through the long centuries there has been no variableness or shadow of change in the essential features of the life which is our contemplation and our care. the sick love-child of Israel's sweet singer, the plague-stricken hopes of the great Athenian statesman, Elpenor, bereft of his beloved Artemidora, and Tully's daughter, mourned so tenderly, are not of any age or any race. They are here with us today, with the Hamlets, the Ophelias, and the Lears. Amid an eternal heritage of sorrow and suffering our work is laid, and this eternal note of sadness would be insupportable if the daily tragedies were not relieved by the spectacle of the heroism and devotion displayed by the actors. Nothing will sustain you more potently than the power to recognize in your humdrum routine, as perhaps it may be thought, the true poetry of life, the poetry of the commonplace, of the ordinary man, of the plain, toil-worn woman, with their loves and their joys, their sorrows and their griefs. The comedy, too, of life will be spread before you, and nobody laughs more often than the doctor at the pranks Puck plays upon the Titanias and the Bottoms among his patients. The humorous side is really almost as frequently turned towards him as the tragic. Lift up one hand to heaven and thank your stars if they have given you the proper sense to enable you to appreciate the inconceivably droll situation in which we catch our fellow creatures. Unhappily, this is one of the free gifts of the gods, unevenly distributed, not bestowed on all, or on all in equal portions. In undue measure it is not without risk, and in any case, in the doctor, it is better appreciated by the eye than expressed on the tongue. Hilarity and good humor, a breezy cheerfulness, a nature sloping toward the southern side, as Lowell has it, help enormously both in the study and in the practice of medicine. To many of a somber and sour disposition it is hard to maintain good spirits amid the trials and tribulations of the day, and yet it is an unpardonable mistake to go about among patients with a long face. Divide your attentions equally between books and men. The strength of the student of books is to sit still, 2 or 3 hours at a stretch, eating the heart out of a subject with pencil and notebook in hand, determined to master the details and intricacies, focusing all your energies on its difficulties. Get accustomed to test all sorts of book problems and statements for yourself, and take as little as possible on trust. The Hunterian "do not think, but try" attitude of the mind is the important one to cultivate. The question came up one day, when discussing the grooves left on the nails after fever, how long it took for the nail to grow out from root to edge. A majority of the class had no further interest. A few looked it up in books. 2 men marked their nails at the root with nitrate of silver, and a few months later had positive knowledge on the subject. They showed the proper spirit. The little points that come up in your reading try to test for yourselves. With one fundamental difficulty many of you will have to contend from the outset, a lack of proper preparation for really hard study. No one can have watched successive groups of young men pass through the special schools without profoundly regretting the haphazard, fragmentary character of their preliminary education. It does seem too bad that we cannot have a student in his 18th year sufficiently grounded in the humanities and in the sciences preliminary to medicine. But this is an educational problem with which only a Milton or a Locke could discourse with profit. With pertinacity you can overcome the preliminary defects, and once thoroughly interested, the work in books becomes a pastime. A serious drawback in the student life is the self-consciousness bred of too close devotion to books. A man gets shy, dysopic, as old Timothy Bright calls it, and shuns the looks of men, and blushes like a girl. The strength of a student of men is to travel, to study men, their habits, character, mode of life, their behavior under varied conditions, their vices, virtues, and peculiarities. Begin with a careful observation of your fellow students and of your teachers. Then every patient you see is a lesson in much more than the malady from which he suffers. Mix as much as you possibly can with the outside world, and learn its ways. Cultivated systematically, the student societies, the students' union, the gymnasium, and the outside social circle will enable you to conquer the diffidence so apt to go with bookishness, and which may prove a very serious drawback in after life. I cannot too strongly impress upon the earnest and attentive men among you the necessity of overcoming this unfortunate failing in your student days. It is not easy for every one to reach a happy medium, and the distinction between a proper self-confidence and cheek, particularly in junior students, is not always to be made. The latter is met with chiefly among the student pilgrims who, in traveling down the Delectable Mountains, have gone astray and have passed to the left hand, where lieth the country of conceit, the country in which, you remember, the brisk lad Ignorance met Christian. I wish we could encourage on this continent among our best students the habit of wandering. I do not know that we are quite prepared for it, as there is still great diversity in the curricula, even among the leading schools, but it is undoubtedly a great advantage to study under different teachers, as the mental horizon is widened and the sympathies enlarged. The practice would do much to lessen that narrow "I am Paul and I am of Apollos" spirit, which is hostile to the best interests of the profession. There is much that I would like to say on the question of work, but I can spare only a few moments for a word or two. Who will venture to settle upon so simple a matter as the best time for work? One will tell us there is no best time, all are equally good, and truly all times are the same to a man whose soul is absorbed in some great problem. The other day I asked Edward Martin, the well-known story writer, what time he found best for work. "Not in the evening, and never between meals," was his answer, which may appeal to some of my hearers. One works best at night, another in the morning. A majority of the students of the past favor the latter. Erasmus, the great exemplar, says, "Never work at night, it dulls the brain and hurts the health." One day, going with George Ross through Bedlam, Dr. Savage, at that time the physician in charge, remarked upon two great groups of patients, those who were depressed in the morning and those who were cheerful, and he suggested that the spirit rose and fell with the bodily temperature. Those with very low morning temperatures were depressed, and vice versa. This, I believe, expresses a truth which may explain the extraordinary difference in the habits of students in this matter of the time at which the best work can be done. Outside of the asylum there are also the two great types, the student lark who loves to see the sun rise, who comes to breakfast with a cheerful morning face, never so fit as at 6 a.m. We all know the type. What a contrast to the student owl, with his saturnine morning face, thoroughly unhappy, cheated by the wretched breakfast bell of the two best hours of the day for sleep, no appetite, and permeated with an unspeakable hostility to his vis-à-vis, whose morning garrulity and good humor are equally offensive. Only gradually, as the day wears on and his temperature rises, does he become endurable to himself and to others. But see him really awake at 10 p.m., while our blithe lark is in hopeless coma over his books, from which it is hard to rouse him sufficiently to get his boots off for bed. Our lean owl friend, Saturn no longer in the ascendant, with bright eyes and cheery face, is ready for 4 hours of anything you wish, deep study or heart affluence in discursive talk, and by 2 a.m. he will undertake to unsphere the spirit of Plato. In neither a virtue, in neither a fault, we must recognize these two types of students, differently constituted, owing possibly, though I have but little evidence for the belief, to thermal peculiarities. End of Essay 12. Essay 13 of Modern Essays, selected by Christopher Morley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 13, The Decline of the Drama, by Stephen Leacock. 1910 was an important year. Halley's comet came along, and some predicted the end of the world. And Stephen Leacock's first humorous book, Literary Lapses, was published. First humorous book, I said, for Mr. Leacock, who is Professor of Political Economy at McGill University, Montreal, had published his Elements of Political Science in 1906. It seems to me that I have heard that Literary Lapses was obscurely or privately published in Canada before 1910, that Mr. John Lane, the famous London publisher, was given a copy by someone as he got on a steamer to go home to England, that he read it on the voyage and cabled an offer for it as soon as he landed. This is very vague in my mind, but it sounds probable. At any rate, since that time, Professor Leacock's humorous volumes have appeared with gratifying regularity, nonsense novels, Behind the Beyond, etc., and some more serious books, too, such as Essays and Literary Studies and The Unsolved Riddle of Social Justice. One of the unsolved riddles of social injustice is, why should Professor Leacock be so much more amusing than most people? We usually think of him as a Canadian, but he was born in England in 1869. Coming up home the other night in my car, the Guy Street car, I heard a man who was hanging on to a strap say, "The drama is just turning into a bunch of talk." This set me thinking, and I was glad that it did, because I am being paid by this paper to think once a week, and it is wearing. Some days I never think from morning till night. This decline of the drama is a thing on which I feel deeply and bitterly, for I am, or I have been, something of an actor myself. I have only been in amateur work, I admit, but still I have played some mighty interesting parts. I have acted in Shakespeare as a citizen, I have been a fairy in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and I was once one end (choice of ends) of a camel in a pantomime. I have had other parts, too, such as A Voice Speaks from Within, or A Noise is Heard Without, or A Bell Rings from Behind, and a lot of things like that. I played as A Noise for 7 nights before crowded houses where people were being turned away from the door, and I have been a groan and a sigh and a tumult, and once I was a Vision Passes Before the Sleeper. So when I talk of acting and of the spirit of the drama, I speak of what I know. Naturally, too, I was brought into contact, very often into quite intimate personal contact, with some of the greatest actors of the day. I don't say it in any way of boasting, but merely because to those of us who love the stage all dramatic souvenirs are interesting. I remember, for example, that when Wilson Barrett played the Bat and had to wear the queer suit with the scales, it was I who put the glue on him. And I recall a conversation with Sir Henry Irving one night when he said to me, "Fetch me a glass of water, will you?" And I said, "Sir Henry, it is not only a pleasure to get it, but it is to me, as a humble devotee of the art that you have ennobled, a high privilege. I will go further." "Do," he said. Henry was like that, quick, sympathetic, what we call in French vibrant. Forbes Robertson I shall never forget. He owes me 50 cents. And as for Martin Harvey, I simply cannot call him Sir John, we are such dear old friends. He never comes to this town without at once calling in my services to lend a hand in his production. No doubt everybody knows that splendid play in which he appears called The Breed of the Treshams. There is a torture scene in it, a most gruesome thing. Harvey, as the hero, has to be tortured, not on the stage itself, but off the stage in a little room at the side. You can hear him howling as he is tortured. Well, it was I who was torturing him. We are so used to working together that Harvey didn't want to let anybody do it but me. So naturally I am a keen friend and student of the drama, and I hate to think of it going all to pieces. The trouble with it is that it is becoming a mere mass of conversation and reflection. Nothing happens in it. The action is all going out of it, and there is nothing left but thought. When actors begin to think, it is time for a change. They are not fitted for it. Now in my day, I mean when I was at the apogee of my reputation, I think that is the word, it may be apology, I forget, things were very different. What we wanted was action, striking, climatic, catastrophic action, in which things not only happened, but happened suddenly and all in a lump. And we always took care that the action happened in some place that was worth while, not simply in an ordinary room with ordinary furniture, the way it is in the new drama. The scene was laid in a lighthouse, top story, or in a madhouse, at midnight, or in a powerhouse, or a doghouse, or a bathhouse, in short, in some place with a distinct local color and atmosphere. I remember in the case of the first play I ever wrote, I write plays, too, the manager to which I submitted it asked me at once the moment he glanced at it, "Where is the action of this laid?" "It is laid," I answered, "in the main sewer of a great city." "Good, good," he said, "keep it there." In the case of another play the manager said to me, "What are you doing for atmosphere?" "The opening act," I said, "is in a steam laundry." "Very good," he answered as he turned over the pages, "and have you brought in a condemned cell?" I told him that I had not. "That's rather unfortunate," he said, "because we are especially anxious to bring in a condemned cell. 3 of the big theatres have got them this season, and I think we ought to have it in. Can you do it?" "Yes," I said, "I can if it's wanted. I'll look through the cast and no doubt I can find one at least of them that ought to be put to death." "Yes, yes," said the manager enthusiastically, "I am sure you can." But I think of all the settings that we used, the lighthouse plays were the best. There is something about a lighthouse that you don't get in a modern drawing room. What it is, I don't know, but there's a difference. I always have liked a lighthouse play, and never have enjoyed acting so much, have never thrown myself into acting so deeply as in a play of that sort. There is something about a lighthouse, the way you see it in the earlier scenes, with the lantern shining out over the black waters that suggests security, fidelity, faithfulness to a trust. The stage used generally to be dim in the first part of a lighthouse play, and you could see the huddled figures of the fishermen and their wives on the foreshore pointing out to the sea, the back of the stage. "See," one cried with his arm extended, "there's lightning in the sky." I was the lightning, and that my cue for it. "God help all the poor souls at sea to night." Then a woman cried, "Look, look, a boat upon the reef." And as she said it, I had to rush round and work the boat to make it go up and down properly. Then there was more lightning, and some one screamed out, "Look, see, there's a woman in the boat." There wasn't really. It was me, but in the darkness it was all the same, and of course the heroine herself couldn't be there yet because she had to be downstairs getting dressed to be drowned. Then they all cried out, "Poor soul, she's doomed," and all the fishermen ran up and down making a noise. Fishermen in those plays used to get fearfully excited, and what with the excitement and the darkness and the bright beams of the lighthouse falling on the wet oilskins and the thundering of the sea upon the reef, ah me, those were plays. That was acting. And to think that there isn't a single streak of lightning in any play on the boards this year. And then the kind of climax that a play like this used to have. The scene shifted right at the moment of the excitement, and lo, we were in the tower, the top story of the lighthouse, interior scene. All is still and quiet within, with the bright light of the reflectors flooding the little room, and the roar of the storm heard like muffled thunder outside. The lighthouse keeper trims his lamps. How firm and quiet and rugged he looks! The snows of 60 winters are on his head, but his eye is clear and his grip strong. Hear the howl of the wind as he opens the door and steps forth upon the iron balcony, 80 feet above the water, and peers out upon the storm. "God pity all the poor souls at sea," he says. They all say that. If you get used to it and get to like it, you want to hear it said, no matter how often they say it. The waves rage beneath him." I threw it at him, really, but the effect was wonderful. And then, as he comes in from the storm to the still room, the climax breaks. A man staggers into the room in oilskins, drenched, wet, breathless. They all staggered in these plays, and in the new drama they walk, and the effect is feebleness itself. He points to the sea. "A boat upon the reef, with a woman in it." And the lighthouse keeper knows that it is his only daughter, the only one that he has, who is being cast to death upon the reef. Then comes the dilemma. They want him for the lifeboat. No one can take it through the surf but him. You know that because the other man says so himself. But if he goes in the boat, then the great light will go out. Untended, it cannot live in the storm. And if it goes out, if it goes out! Ask of the angry waves and the resounding rocks of what to-night's long toll of death must be without the light. I wish you could have seen it, you who only see the drawing-room plays of to-day, the scene when the lighthouse man draws himself up, calm and resolute, and says, "My place is here. God's will be done." And you know that as he says it and turns quietly to his lamps again, the boat is drifting at that very moment to the rocks. How did they save her? My dear sir, if you can ask that question, you little understand the drama as it was. Save her? No, of course they didn't save her. What we wanted in the old drama was reality and force, no matter how wild and tragic it might be. They did not save her. They found her the next day, in the concluding scene, all that was left of her when she was dashed upon the rocks. Her ribs were broken, her bottom boards had been smashed in, her gunwale was gone. In short, she was a wreck. The girl? Oh, yes, certainly they saved the girl. That kind of thing was always taken care of. You see, just as the lighthouse man said, "God's will be done," his eye fell on a long coil of rope hanging there. Providential, wasn't it? But then we were not ashamed to use Providence in the old drama. So he made a noose in it and threw it over the balcony and hauled the girl up on it. I used to hook her onto it every night. A rotten play? Oh, I am sure it must have been. But somehow those of us who were brought up on that sort of thing still sigh for it. End of Essay 13. Essay 14 of Modern Essays, selected by Christopher Morley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 14, America and the English Tradition, by Harry Morgan Ayres. This admirable summary of Anglo-American history first appeared, February 1920, as an editorial in the Weekly Review. It seemed to me then, and still does, as a model in that form of writing, perfect in lucidity, temperance, and good sense. Mr. Ayres is a member of the faculty of Columbia University, Department of English, and also one of the editors of the Weekly Review. Beowulf, Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Seneca seem to be his favorite hobbies. To sum up the gist of Anglo-American relations in half a dozen pages, as Mr. Ayres does here, is surely a remarkable achievement. The recently established chair in the history, literature, and institutions of the United States, which is to be shared among the several universities of Great Britain, is quite different from the exchange professorships of sometimes unhappy memory. It is not at all the idea to carry over one of our professors each year and indoctrinate him with the true culture at its source. The occupant of the chair will be, if the announced intention is carried out, quite as often British as American, and quite as likely a public man as a professor. The chief object is to bring to England a better knowledge of the United States, and a purpose more laudable can scarcely be imagined. Peace and prosperity will endure in the world in some very precise relation to the extent to which England succeeds in understanding us. It is not an illusion to suppose that our understanding of the British is on the whole better than theirs of us. The British Empire is a large and comparatively simple fact, now conspicuously before the world for a long time. The United States was, in British eyes, until recently, a comparatively insignificant fact, yet vastly more complicated than they imagined. Each, of course, perfectly knew the faults of the other, assessed with an unerring cousinly eye. The American bragged in a nasal whine, the Briton patronized in a throaty burble. Whoever among the struggling nations of the world might win, England saw to it that she never lost. Your Yankee was content with the more ignoble triumphs of merchandising, willing to cheapen life if he could only add to his dollars. But the excellence of English political institutions and methods, the charm of English life, the tremendous power of the Empire for promoting freedom and civilization in the world, these are things which Americans have long recognized and in a way understood. Anything like an equivalent British appreciation of America in the large seems confined to a very few honorable exceptions among them. Admiration for Niagara, which is half British anyway, or enthusiasm for the Wild West (your better class Englishman always thrills to the frontier), is no step at all toward rightly appreciating America. To no inconsiderable extent this is America's own fault. She does not present to the world a record that is easily read. It is obvious, for instance, and so obvious that it is not often enough stated, that America has and will continue to have a fundamentally English civilization. English law is the basis of her law. English speech is her speech. And if with a difference, it is a difference that the philologist, all things considered, finds amazingly small. English literature is her literature. Chaucer and Shakespeare hers, because her blood then coursed indistinguishably through the English heart they knew so well. Milton, Dryden, and the Queen Anne men hers, because she was still a part of England. The later men hers by virtue of affectionate acquaintanceship and a generous and not inconsiderable rivalry. English history, in short, is her history. The struggles of the 13th century through which law and Parliament came into being, the struggles of the 17th century through which law and Parliament came to rule, are America's struggles upon which she can look back with the satisfaction that some things that have been done in the world need never be undone or done over again, whatever the room for improvement may still be. Americans, no less than British, recognized that independence was largely an accidental result of a war which sprang out of a false theory of economics, but whose conclusion carried with it a lesson in the management of empire which subsequent history shows the British to have learned thoroughly and for the benefit of all concerned. American independence, however, once established, pointed a way to democratic freedom which England hastened to follow. This we know, and yet we allow these obvious and fundamental considerations to become marvelously obscured. We allow England's failure to solve an insoluble Irish problem to arouse in us an attitude of mind possibly excusable in some Irishmen, but wholly inexcusable in any American. We allow a sentimental regard for some immigrant from Eastern Europe who comes to us with a philosophy born of conditions that in English-speaking lands ceased to be centuries ago, to make us pretend to see in him the true expression of America's traditional ideals. We allow ourselves to be far too easy with the phrase, "He is not pro-German, he is merely anti-British." Why are they anti-British? Why should they be permitted to make it falsely appear that recognition of the English basis of America involves approval of everything that England in her history may or may not have done? Why should they be allowed to pretend that disapproval of some particular act of England justifies repudiation of most of the things by virtue of which we are what we are? America from the first has been part of the great English experiment, great because it is capable of learning from experience. The world has put a big investment in blood and treasure, and all that they imply, into the education of England. It is satisfied, the world's response to Germany's insolent challenge is the proof of it, that its pains have been well bestowed. England is more nearly fit than any other nation to wield the power that is hers. That is not to deny the peculiar virtues of other nations. Indeed, these virtues have largely contributed to the result. Italy has educated her. France has educated her. We have done something. And Germany. In result, she is not perfect (the English would perhaps least of all assert that), but she has learned a great deal, and held herself steady while she learned it. It is a bigger job than the world cares to undertake to teach any other nation so much. Nor would it be at all likely to succeed so well. For what England has to offer the world in return is not simply her institutions. It is not merely a formula for the effective discharge of police duty throughout the world. It is the English freeman, whether he hail from Canada, Australia, Africa, or the uttermost isles of the sea. A most adaptable fellow, the freeman, doing all sorts of work everywhere, and with tremendous powers of assimilation. Consider him in his origins. He began by assimilating fully his own weight in Danes, while remaining an English freeman. He then perforce accepted a Norman king as he had accepted a Danish one, hoping, as always, that the king would not trouble him too much. But when Norman William, who was very ill-informed about the breed, killed off most of his natural leaders and harried the rest into villeiny, how did he manage in a small matter of 200 years or so to make an English gentleman not only of himself, but of all the rag-tag of adventurers who had come over with William and since? How did he contrive, out of a band of exiles fleeing from an Egypt of ecclesiastical tyranny, broken younger sons, artisans out of a job, speculators, bondmen, Swedes, Dutchmen, and what not, to make America? Is he one likely to lose his bearings when in his America the age-old problem again heaves into view? This is a job he has been working at pretty successfully for more than 1,000 years. Grant him a moment to realize himself afresh in the face of it. Don't expect him to stop and give a coherent explanation of what he is doing. He wouldn't be the true son of the English tradition that he is if he could do that. Perhaps the occupants of the new chair can do something of the sort for him. End of Essay 14. Essay 15 of Modern Essays selected by Christopher Morley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 15, The Russian Quarter, by Thomas Burke. Thomas Burke, a young newspaperman in London, came into quick recognition with his first book, Nights in Town, published in America as Nights in London in 1915. His first really popular success, however, was Limehouse Nights, less satisfactory to those who had read the first book, as it was largely a repetition of the same material in fiction form. In fact, Mr. Burke holds what must be almost a record among authors by having worked over nearly the identical substance in 4 different versions, as essays and sketches in Nights in Town, as short stories in Limehouse Nights, as a novel in Twinkletoes, as poetry in The Song Book of Quang Li of Limehouse. Mr. Burke has specialized on London, and with great ability. In the Limehouse series his colorings seem just a little too consciously vivid, his roguishness a little too studied, to be quite satisfying. The Outer Circle, a volume of rambles in the London suburbs, is to me more truly a work of art. I had known the Quarter for many years before it interested me. It was not until I was prowling around on a Fleet Street assignment that I learned to hate it. A murder had been committed over a café in Lupin Street. A popular murder, fruity, cleverly done, and with a sex interest. Of course, every newspaper and agency developed a virtuous anxiety to track the culprit, and all resources were directed to that end. Journalism is perhaps the only profession in which so fine a public spirit may be found. So it was that the North Country paper of which I was a hanger-on flung every available man into the fighting line, and the editor told me that I might, in place of the casual paragraphs for the London Letter, do something good on the Vassiloff murder. It was a night of cold rain, and the pavements were washed with smears of light from the shop windows. Through the streaming streets my hansom leaped, and as I looked from the window and noted the despondent biliousness of Bethnal Green, I realized that the grass withereth, the flower fadeth. I dismissed the cab at Brick Lane, and continuing the tradition which had been instilled into me by my predecessor on the London Letter, I turned into one of the hostelries and had a vodka to keep the cold out. Little Russia was shutting up. The old shawled women, who sit at every corner with huge baskets of black bread and sweet cakes, were departing beneath umbrellas. The stalls of Osborne Street, usually dressed with foreign-looking confectionery, were also retiring. Indeed, everybody seemed to be slinking away, and as I sipped my vodka and felt it burn me with raw fire, I cursed news editors and all publics which desired to read about murders. I was perfectly sure that I shouldn't do the least good. So I had another, and gazed through the kaleidoscopic window, rushing with rain, at the cheerful world that held me. Oh, so sad it is, this quarter. By day the streets are a depression, with their frowsy doss-houses and their vapour baths. Grey and sickly is the light. Grey and sickly, too, are the leering shops, and grey and sickly are the people and the children. Everything has followed the grass and the flowers. Childhood has no place. So above the roofs you may see the surly points of a council school. Such games as happen are played but listlessly, and each little face is smirched. The gaunt warehouses hardly support their lopping heads, and the low, beetling, gabled houses of the alleys seem forever to brood on nights of bitter adventure. Fit objects for contempt by day they may be, but when night creeps upon London, the hideous darkness that can almost be touched, then their faces become very powers of terror, and the cautious soul, wandered from the comfort of the main streets, walks and walks in a frenzy, seeking outlet and finding none. Sometimes a hoarse laugh will break sharp on his ear, then he runs. Well, I finished my second, and then sauntered out. As I was passing a cruel-looking passage, a girl stepped forward. She looked at me. I looked at her. She had the haunting melancholy of Russia in her face, but her voice was as the voice of Cockaigne, for she spoke and said, "Funny-looking little guy, ain't you?" I suppose I was, so I smiled and said, "We are as God made us, old girl." She giggled. I said I felt sure I should do no good on the Vassiloff murder. I didn't, for just then two of her friends came out of the court, each with a boy. It was apparent that she had no boy. I had no idea what the occasion might be, but the other four marched ahead, crying, "Come on!" And surprised, yet knowing of no good reason for being surprised, I felt the girl's arm slip into mine, and we joined the main column. That is one of London's greatest charms. It is always ready to toss you little encounters of this sort if you are out for them. Across the road we went, through mire and puddle, and down a long winding court. At about midway our friends disappeared, and suddenly drawn to the right, I was pushed from behind up a steep, fusty stair. Then I knew where we were going. We were going to the tenements where most of the Russians meet of an evening. The atmosphere in these places is a little more cheerful than that of the cafés, if you can imagine a Russian ever rising to cheerfulness. Most of the girls lodge over the milliners' shops, and thither their friends resort. Every establishment here has a piano, for music with them is a sombre passion rather than a diversion. You will not hear comic opera, but if you want to climb the lost heights of melody, stand in Bell Yard and listen to a piano, lost in the high glooms, wailing the heart of Chopin or Rubinstein or Glazunov through the fingers of pale, moist girls, while the ghost of Peter the Painter parades the naphtha'd highways. At the top of the stair I was pushed into a dark, fusty room and guided to a low, fusty sofa or bed. Then some one struck a match, and a lamp was lit and set on the mantelshelf. It flung a soft, caressing radiance on its shabby home, and on its mistress, and on the other girls and boys. The boys were tough youngsters of the district, evidently very much at home, smoking Russian cigarettes and settling themselves on the bed in a manner that seemed curiously continental in Cockney toughs. I doubt if you would have loved the girls at that moment, and yet, you know, their black or brassy hair, their untidiness, and the cotton blouses half dropped from their tumultuous breasts. The girl who had collared me disappeared for a moment, and then brought a tray of Russian tea. "Help yourselves, boys." We did so, and watching the others, I discovered that it was the correct thing to lemon the ladies' tea for them, and stir it well and light their cigarettes. I did so for Katarina, that was her name, while she watched me with little truant locks of hair running everywhere, and a slow, alluring smile that seemed to hold all the agony and mystery of the steppes. The room, on which the wallpaper hung in dank strips, contained a full-sized bed and a chair bedstead, a washstand, a samovar, a potpourri of a carpet, and certain mysteries of feminine toilette. A rickety three-legged table stood by the window, and Katarina's robes hung in a dainty riot of frill and colour behind the door, which only shut when you thrust a peg of wood through a wired catch. One of the boys sprawled himself in clumsy luxury on the bed, and his girl arranged herself at his side, and when she was settled, her hair tumbled in a shower of hairpins, and everybody laughed like children. The other girl went to the piano, and her boy squatted on the floor at her feet. She began to play. You would not understand, I suppose, the intellectual emotion of the situation. It was more than curious to sit in these rooms, in the filthiest spot in London, and listen to Moszkowski, Tchaikovsky, and Sibelius, played by a factory girl. It is something indefinable. I had visited similar places in Stepney before, but then I had not had a couple of vodkas, and I had not been taken in tow by an unknown girl. They play and play, while tea and cigarettes and sometimes vodka or whiskey go around. And as the room gets warmer, so does one's sense of smell get sharper, so do the pale faces get moister, and so does one long more and more for a breath of cold air from the Ural Mountains. The best you can do is to ascend to the flat roof and take a deep breath of Spitalfields ozone. Then back to the room for more tea and more music. Sonia played. Despite the unventilated room, the greasy appointments, and other details that would have turned the stomach of Kensington, that girl at the piano, her dress cunningly disarranged, playing, as no one would have dreamed she could play, the finer intensities of Wieniawski and Mussorgsky, shook all sense of responsibility from me. The burdens of life vanished. News editors and their assignments be damned. Enjoy yourself, was what the cold, insidious music said. Take your moments when the fates send them. That was life's best lesson. Snatch the joy of the fleeting moment. Why ponder on time and tears? Devilish little fingers they were, Sonia's. Her technique was not perhaps all that it might have been. She might not have won the gold medal of our white-shirted academies, but she had enough temperament to make half a dozen Bechstein Hall virtuosi. From valse to nocturne, from sonata to prelude, her fancy ran. With crashing chords she dropped from l'Automne Bacchanal to the nocturne in E-flat, scarcely murmured of that, then tripped elvishly into Moszkowski's waltz, and from that she dropped to a song of Tchaikovsky, almost heart-breaking in its childish beauty, and then to the lecherous music of the second act of Tristan. Mazurka, polonaise, and nocturne wailed in the stuffy chamber. Her little hands lit up the enchanted gloom of the place with bright thrills, until the bed and the dingy surroundings faded into phantoms and left only two stark souls in colloquy, Katarina's and mine. Katarina had settled, I forgot how, on the sofa, and was reclining very comfortably with her head on my shoulder and both arms about me. We did not talk. No questions passed as to why we had picked one another up. There we were, warmed with vodka and tea, at 11 o'clock at night, 5 stories above the clamorous world, while her friends shook the silly souls out of us. With the shy boldness of my native country, I stretched a hand and enclosed her fingers. She smiled, a curious smile that no other girl in London could have given. Not a flushed smile, or a startled smile, or a satisfied smile, or a coy smile, but a smile of companionship, which seemed to have realized the tragedy of our living. So it was that she had, by slow stages, reached her comfortable position, for as my hand wandered from finger to wrist, from wrist to soft, rounded arm, and so enclosed her neck, she slipped and buried me in an avalanche of flaming, scented tresses. Sonia at the piano shot a glance over her shoulder, a very sad, gay glance. She laughed curiously, I almost said foreignly. I felt somehow as though I had been taken complete possession of by these people. I hardly belonged to myself. Fleet Street was but a street of dream. I seemed now to be awake and in an adorable captivity. With a final volley of chords, the pianist slid from the chair and sat by her boy on the carpet, smoothing his face with tobacco-stained fingers, and languishing, while her thick, overripe lips took his kisses as a baby bird takes food from its mother. We talked, all of us, in jerks and snatches. Then the oil in the lamp began to give out, and the room grew dim. Some one said, "Play something," and some one said, "Too tired." The girl reclining on the bed grew snappy. She did not lean for caresses. She seemed morose, preoccupied, almost impatient. Twice she snapped up her boy on a casual remark. I believe I talked vodka'd nonsense. But suddenly there came a whisper of soft feet on the landing, and a secret tap at the door. Some one opened it and slipped out. One heard the lazy hum of voices in busy conversation, then silence, and some one entered the room and shut the door. One of the boys asked casually, "What's up?" His question was not answered, but the girl who had gone to the door snapped something in a sharp tone which might have been either Russian or Yiddish. Katerina loosened herself from me and sat up. The girl on the bed sat up. The 3 of them spat angry phrases about. I called over to one of the boys, "What's the joke? Something wrong?" and received a reply, "How should I know? I ain't a ruddy Russian, am I?" Katerina suddenly drew back her flaming face. "Here," she said, "you better go." "Go?" "Yes, fathead, go's what I said." "But," I began, looking and feeling like a flabbergasted cat, "don't I speak plain? Go!" I suppose a man never feels a finer idiot than when a woman tells him she doesn't want him. If he ever does, it is when a woman tells him that she loves him. Katerina had given me the bullet, and of course I felt a fool, but I derived some consolation from the fact that the other boys were being told off. Clearly big things were in the air, about to happen. Something evidently had already happened. I wondered. Then I sat down on the sofa and flatly told Katerina that I was not going unless I had a reason. "Oh," she said blithely, "ain't you? This is my room, ain't it? I brought you here, and you stay here just as long as I choose, and no longer. Who d'you think you are, saying you won't go? This is my room. I let you come here for a drink, and you just got to go when I say. See?" I was about to make a second stand, when again there came a stealthy tap at the door, and the whispering of slippered feet. Sonia glided to the door, opened it, and disappeared. In a moment she came back and called, "Rena!" Katerina slipped from my embrace, went to the door, and disappeared too. 1 girl and 3 boys remained, in silence. Next moment Katerina reappeared and said something to Sonia. Sonia pulled her boy by the arm and went out. The other girl pushed her boy at the neck and literally threw him out. Katerina came over to me and said, "Go, little fool." I said, "Shan't, unless I know what the game is." She stood over me, glared, searched for words to meet the occasion, found none. She gestured. I sat as rigid as an immobile comedian. Finally she flung her arm and swept away. At the door she turned. "Blasted little fool, he'll do us both in if you ain't careful. You don't know him. Both of us he'll have. Serve you right." She disappeared. I was alone. I heard the sup-sup of her slippered feet down the stair. I got up and moved to the door. I heard nothing. I stood by the window, my thoughts dancing a ragtime. I wondered what to do, and how, and whether. I wondered what was up exactly. I wondered, well, I just wondered. My thoughts got into a tangle, sank and swam and sank again. Then there was a sudden struggle and spurt from the lamp, and it went black out. From a room across the landing a clock ticked menacingly. I saw by the thin light from the window the smoke of a discarded cigarette curling up and up to the ceiling like a snake. I went again to the door, peered down the steep stair and over the crazy balustrade. Nobody was about. No voices. I slipped swiftly down the 5 flights, met nobody. I stood in the slobbered vestibule. From afar I heard the sluck of the water against the staples of the wharves and the wicked hoot of the tugs. It was then that a sudden nameless fear seized me. It was that simple terror that comes from nothing but ourselves. I am not usually afraid of any man or thing. I am normally nervous, and there are 3 or 4 things that have power to terrify me. But I am not, I think, afraid. At that moment, however, I was afraid of everything. Of the room I had left, of the house, of the people, of the inviting lights of the warehouses, and the threatening shoals of alleys. I stood a moment longer. Then I raced into Brick Lane and out into the brilliance of Commercial Street. End of Essay 15. Essay 16 of Modern Essays, selected by Christopher Morley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 16, A Word for Autumn, by A. Milne. This is the sort of urbane pleasantry in which British essayists are prolific and graceful. Alan Alexander Milne was born in 1882, went to Trinity College, Cambridge, was editor of the Granta, the leading undergraduate publication at Cambridge at that time, and plunged into the great whirlpool of London journalism. He was on the staff of Punch, 1906 14. He has now collected several volumes of charming essays, and has had considerable success as a playwright. His comedy, Mr. Pym Passes By, recently played a prosperous run in New York. A Word for Autumn is from his volume, Not That It Matters. Last night the waiter put the celery on with the cheese, and I knew that summer was indeed dead. Other signs of autumn there may be, the reddening leaf, the chill of the early morning air, the misty evenings, but none of these comes home to me so truly. There may be cool mornings in July. In a year of drought the leaves may change before their time. It is only with the first celery that summer is over. I knew all along that it would not last. Even in April I was saying that winter would soon be here. Yet somehow it had begun to seem possible lately that a miracle might happen, that summer might drift on and on through the months, a final upheaval to crown a wonderful year. The celery settled that. Last night, with the celery, autumn came into its own. There is a crispness about celery that is of the essence of October. It is as fresh and clean as a rainy day after a spell of heat. It crackles pleasantly in the mouth. Moreover, it is excellent, I am told, for the complexion. One is always hearing of things which are good for the complexion, but there is no doubt that celery stands high on the list. After the burns and freckles of summer, one is in need of something. How good that celery should be there at one's elbow! A week ago—a little more cheese, waiter? A week ago I grieved for the dying summer. I wondered how I could possibly bear the waiting, the 8 long months till May. In vain to comfort myself with the thought that I could get through more works in the winter undistracted by thoughts of cricket grounds and country houses. In vain equally to tell myself that I could stay in bed later in the mornings. Even the thought of after-breakfast pipes in front of the fire left me cold. But now, suddenly, I am reconciled to autumn. I see quite clearly that all good things must come to an end. The summer has been splendid, but it has lasted long enough. This morning I welcomed the chill in the air. This morning I viewed the falling leaves with cheerfulness. And this morning I said to myself, "Why, of course, I'll have celery for lunch. More bread, waiter." "Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness," said Keats, not actually picking out celery in so many words, but plainly including it in the general blessings of the autumn. Yet what an opportunity he missed by not concentrating on that precious root. Apples, grapes, nuts, and vegetable marrows he mentions specially, and how poor a selection! For apples and grapes are not typical of any month, so ubiquitous are they. Vegetable marrows are vegetables pour rire, and have no place in any serious consideration of the seasons, while as for nuts, have we not a national song which asserts distinctly, "Here we go gathering nuts in May"? Season of mists and mellow celery, then let it be. A pat of butter underneath the bough, a wedge of cheese, a loaf of bread, and thou. How delicate are the tender shoots unfolded layer by layer! Of what a whiteness is the last baby one of all! Of what a sweetness his flavor! It is well that this should be the last rite of the meal, finis coronat opus, so that we may go straight on to the business of the pipe. Celery demands a pipe rather than a cigar, and it can be eaten better in an inn or a London tavern than in the home. Yes, and it should be eaten alone, for it is the only food which one really wants to hear oneself eat. Besides, in company one may have to consider the wants of others. Celery is not a thing to share with any man. Alone in your country inn you may call for the celery, but if you are wise you will see that no other traveler wanders into the room. Take warning from one who has learnt a lesson. One day I lunched alone at an inn, finishing with cheese and celery. Another traveler came in and lunched too. We did not speak. I was busy with my celery. From the other end of the table he reached across for the cheese. That was all right. It was the public cheese. But he also reached across for the celery, my private celery, for which I owed. Foolishly, you know how one does, I had left the sweetest and crispest shoots till the last, tantalizing myself pleasantly with the thought of them. Horror! To see them snatched from me by a stranger! He realized later what he had done and apologized. But of what good is an apology in such circumstances? Yet at least the tragedy was not without its value. Now one remembers to lock the door. Yes, I can face the winter with calm. I suppose I had forgotten what it was really like. I had been thinking of the winter as a horrid, wet, dreary time, fit only for professional football. Now I can see other things. Crisp and sparkling days, long pleasant evenings, cheery fires. Good work shall be done this winter. Life shall be lived well. The end of the summer is not the end of the world. Here's to October. And, waiter, some more celery. End of Essay 16. Essay 17 of Modern Essays selected by Christopher Morley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 17, A Clergyman, by Max Beerbohm. Max Beerbohm, I dare say, and I believe it has been said before, is the most subtly gifted English essayist since Charles Lamb. It is not surprising that he has, now for many years, been referred to as the incomparable Max. For what other contemporary has never once missed fire, never failed to achieve perfection in the field of his choice? Whether in caricature, short story, fable, parody, or essay, he has always been consummate in grace, tact, insouciant, airy precision. I hope you will not miss No. 2, The Pines, in And Even Now, from which this selection also comes, a reminiscence of his first visit to Swinburne in 1899. That beautiful (there is no other word) essay shows an even ampler range of Mr. Beerbohm's powers, a tenderness and lovely grace that remind one, almost against belief, that the gay youth of the '90s now mellows deliciously with the end of the fifth decade. He was so enormously old in 1896, when he published his first book and called it his Works. He seems much younger now. He is having his first childhood. This portrait of the unfortunate cleric annihilated by Dr. Johnson is a triumphant example of the skill with which a perfect artist can manoeuvre a trifle, carved like an ivory trinket. In such hands subtlety never becomes mere tenuity. Max Beerbohm was born in London in 1872, studied at Charterhouse School and Merton College, Oxford, and was a brilliant figure in the Savoy and Yellow Book circles by the time he was 24. His genius is that of the essay in its purest distillation, a clear cross-section of life as seen through the lens of self, the pure culture, in the biological sense, of observing personality. I have often wondered how it came about, though the matter is wholly non-pertinent, that Mr. Beerbohm married an American lady, quite a habit with English essayists, by the way. Hilaire Belloc and Bertrand Russell did likewise. Who's Who says she was from Memphis, which adds lustre to that admirable city. He now lives in Italy. Fragmentary, pale, momentary, almost nothing, glimpsed and gone, as it were a faint human hand thrust up, never to reappear from beneath the rolling waters of time, he forever haunts my memory and solicits my weak imagination. Nothing is told of him but that once, abruptly, he asked a question and received an answer. This was on the afternoon of April 7th, 1778, at Streatham, in the well-appointed house of Mr. Thrale. Johnson, on the morning of that day, had entertained Boswell at breakfast in Bolt Court, and invited him to dine at Thrale Hall. The two took coach and arrived early. It seems that Sir John Pringle had asked Boswell to ask Johnson what were the best English sermons for style. In the interval before dinner, accordingly, Boswell reeled off the names of several divines whose prose might, or might not, win commendation. "Atterbury?" he suggested. Johnson: "Oh, yes, sir, one of the best." Boswell: "Tillotson." Johnson: "Why, not now. I should not advise any one to imitate Tillotson's style. Though I don't know, I should be cautious of censuring anything that has been applauded by so many suffrages. South is one of the best, if you except his peculiarities and his violence, and sometimes coarseness of language. Seed has a very fine style, but he is not very theological. Jortin's sermons are very elegant. Sherlock's style, too, is very elegant, though he has not made it his principal study. And you may add Smalridge." Boswell: "I like Ogden's sermons on prayer very much, both for neatness of style and subtlety of reasoning." Johnson: "I should like to read all that Ogden has written." Boswell: "What I want to know is, what sermons afford the best specimen of English pulpit eloquence?" Johnson: "We have no sermons addressed to the passions that are good for anything, if you mean that kind of eloquence. A clergyman, whose name I do not recollect. Were not Dodd's sermons addressed to the passions?" Johnson: "They were nothing, sir, be they addressed to what they may." The suddenness of it! Bang! And the rabbit that had popped from its burrow was no more. I know not which is the more startling, the début of the unfortunate clergyman, or the instantaneousness of his end. Why hadn't Boswell told us there was a clergyman present? Well, we may be sure that so careful and acute an artist had some good reason. And I suppose the clergyman was left to take us unawares, because just so did he take the company. Had we been told he was there, we might have expected that sooner or later he would join in the conversation. He would have had a place in our minds. We may assume that in the minds of the company around Johnson he had no place. He sat, forgotten, overlooked; so that his self-assertion startled every one, just as on Boswell's page it startles us. In Johnson's massive and magnetic presence only some very remarkable man, such as Mr. Burke, was sharply distinguishable from the rest. Others might, if they had something in them, stand out slightly. This unfortunate clergyman may have had something in him, but I judge that he lacked the gift of seeming as if he had. That deficiency, however, does not account for the horrid fate that befell him. One of Johnson's strongest and most inveterate feelings was his veneration for the cloth. To any one in holy orders he habitually listened with a grace and charming deference. To-day, moreover, he was in excellent good humor. He was at the Thrales', where he so loved to be. The day was fine. A fine dinner was in close prospect. And he had had what he always declared to be the sum of human felicity, a ride in a coach. Nor was there in the question put by the clergyman anything likely to enrage him. Dodd was one whom Johnson had befriended in adversity, and it had always been agreed that Dodd in his pulpit was very emotional. What drew the blasting flash must have been not the question itself, but the manner in which it was asked. And I think we can guess what that manner was. Say the words aloud. Were not Dodd's sermons addressed to the passions? They are words which, if you have any dramatic and histrionic sense, cannot be said except in a high, thin voice. You may, from sheer perversity, utter them in a rich and sonorous baritone or bass, but if you do so, they sound utterly unnatural. To make them carry the conviction of human utterance, you have no choice. You must pipe them. Remember now, Johnson was very deaf. Even the people whom he knew well, the people to whose voices he was accustomed, had to address him very loudly. It is probable that this unregarded, young, shy clergyman, when at length he suddenly mustered courage to cut in, let his high, thin voice soar too high, inasmuch that it was a kind of scream. On no other hypothesis can we account for the ferocity with which Johnson turned and rended him. Johnson didn't, we may be sure, mean to be cruel. The old lion, startled, just struck out blindly. But the force of paw and claws was not the less lethal. We have endless testimony to the strength of Johnson's voice. And the very cadence of those words, "They were nothing, sir, be they addressed to what they may," convinces me that the old lion's jaws never gave forth a louder roar. Boswell does not record that there was any further conversation before the announcement of dinner. Perhaps the whole company had been temporarily deafened. But I am not bothering about them. My heart goes out to the poor, dear clergyman exclusively. I said a moment ago that he was young and shy, and I admit that I slipped those epithets in without having justified them to you by due process of induction. Your quick mind will have already supplied what I omitted. A man with a high, thin voice, and without power to impress any one with a sense of his importance, a man so null in effect that even the retentive mind of Boswell did not retain his very name, would assuredly not be a self-confident man. Even if he were not naturally shy, social courage would soon have been sapped in him, and would in time have been destroyed by experience. That he had not yet given himself up as a bad job, that he still had faint wild hopes, is proved by the fact that he did snatch the opportunity for asking that question. He must accordingly have been young. Was he the curate of the neighboring church? I think so. It would account for his having been invited. I see him as he sits there, listening to the great doctor's pronouncement on Atterbury and those others. He sits on the edge of a chair in the background. He has colorless eyes, fixed earnestly, and a face almost as pale as the clerical bands beneath his somewhat receding chin. His forehead is high and narrow, his hair mouse-colored. His hands are clasped tight before him, the knuckles standing out sharply. This constriction does not mean that he is steeling himself to speak. He has no positive intention of speaking. Very much, nevertheless, is he wishing in the back of his mind that he could say something, something whereat the great doctor would turn on him and say after a pause for thought, "Why, yes, sir, that is most justly observed," or, "Sir, that has never occurred to me, I thank you," thereby fixing the observer forever high in the esteem of all. And now in a flash the chance presents itself. "We have," shouts Johnson, "no sermons addressed to the passions that are good for anything." I see the curate's frame quiver with sudden impulse, and his mouth fly open, and no, I can't bear it, I shut my eyes and ears. But audible, even so, is something shrill, followed by something thunderous. Presently I reopen my eyes. The crimson has not yet faded from that young face yonder, and slowly down either cheek falls a glistening tear. Shades of Atterbury and Tillotson, such weakness shames the Established Church. What would Jortin and Smalridge have said? What Seed and South? And by the way, who were they, these worthies? It is a solemn thought that so little is conveyed to us by names which to the Paleo-Georgians conveyed so much. We discern a dim composite picture of a big man in a big wig and a billowing black gown, with a big congregation beneath him. But we are not anxious to hear what he is saying. We know it is all very elegant. We know it will be printed and be bound in finely tooled full calf, and no Paleo-Georgian gentleman's library will be complete without it. Literate people in those days were comparatively few. But bating that, one may say that sermons were as much in request as novels are today. I wonder, will mankind continue to be capricious? It is a very solemn thought indeed that no more than 150 years hence the novelists of our time, with all their moral and political and sociological outlook and influence, will perhaps shine as indistinctly as do those old preachers, with all their elegance, now. "Yes, sir," some great pundit may be telling a disciple at this moment, "Wells is one of the best. Galsworthy is one of the best, if you accept his concern for delicacy of style. Mrs. Ward has a very firm grasp of problems, but is not very creational. Cain's books are very edifying. I should like to read all that Cain has written. Miss Corelli, too, is very edifying. And you may add Upton Sinclair." "What I want to know," says the disciple, "is what English novels may be selected as specially enthralling." The pundit answers, "We have no novels addressed to the passions that are good for anything, if you mean that kind of enthralment." And here some poor wretch, whose name the disciple will not remember, inquires, "Are not Mrs. Glyn's novels addressed to the passions?" and is in due form annihilated. Can it be that a time will come when readers of this passage in our pundit's life will take more interest in the poor nameless wretch than in all the bearers of those great names put together, being no more able or anxious to discriminate between, say, Mrs. Ward and Mr. Sinclair, than we are to set Ogden above Sherlock, or Sherlock above Ogden? It seems impossible. But we must remember that things are not always what they seem. Every man illustrious in his day, however much he may be gratified by his fame, looks with an eager eye to posterity for a continuance of past favors, and would even live the remainder of his life in obscurity if by so doing he would ensure that future generations would preserve a correct attitude towards him forever. This is very natural and human, but, like so many very natural and human things, very silly. Tillotson and the rest need not, after all, be pitied for our neglect of them. They either know nothing about it, or are above such terrene trifles. Let us keep our pity for the seething mass of divines who were not elegantly verbose and had no fun or glory while they lasted. And let us keep a specially large portion for one whose lot was so much worse than merely undistinguished. If that nameless curate had not been at the Thrales that day, or being there had kept the silence that so well became him, his life would have been drab enough in all conscience, but at any rate an unpromising career would not have been nipped in the bud. And that is what in fact happened, I'm sure of it. A robust man might have rallied under the blow. Not so our friend. Those who knew him in infancy had not expected that he would be reared. Better for him had they been right. It is well to grow up and be ordained, but not if you are delicate and very sensitive, and shall happen to annoy the greatest, the most stentorian and roughest of contemporary personages. A clergyman never held up his head or smiled again after the brief encounter recorded for us by Boswell. He sank into a rapid decline. Before the next blossoming of Thrales Hall's almond trees he was no more. I like to think that he died forgiving Dr. Johnson. End of Essay 17.